They say that newspapers are the first rough draft of history. But how do you cite a newspaper that doesn't have a headline or a byline? This video will take you through the process of citing historical newspapers. Newspapers of the 18th and 19th century had a very different look and feel to them to what we normally consider a newspaper today. In the first place, they tended to be a lot shorter. Some of them might just be a single piece of paper with the front and back side printed, although most of them tended to be 4 to 16 sides of paper. In terms of their content, they had the typical items such as news and editorials, advertisements, and stock information, but they also had lots of bits of poetry, literature, visual art, and this is very different to what we normally consider a newspaper today, as opposed to a newsletter, a magazine, or some other form of periodical. There was also a tendency not to include headlines or bylines. The newspaper was written as the institution, as the voice of that institution, and although attribution is sometimes given to borrowed works or to particular correspondence, by and large, the information provided is provided by the newspaper as sort of a corporate entity. In terms of headlines, these vary considerably. Sometimes they were the location the news story took place, sometimes they were the location where the news story came from, sometimes they gave outrageous, sensationalized headlines, sometimes they didn't give any headline at all, and news stories would move from one to another, paragraph to paragraph, with no sort of indication of when one article started and the other ended. Without these key bits of information like section headings, headlines, and bylines, how do we go about citing individual articles? Let's take a look at this issue of the Dundee Courier from 1850 and point out some different ways that you might approach historical newspapers. For most of the footnotes that we are going to create, we would want to begin with the name of the author or the creator of the article. But if we look at this particular article on page 2 of the Dundee Courier, we see that although there is a headline, there doesn't appear to be any kind of byline or author attribution. Now, sometimes if it's a letter to the editor or some other type of correspondent, they will have a name of an author at the end of the article, but that's not the case here. Here we simply have the editorial voice, the voice of the Dundee Courier, explaining the news story. So where do we begin? Well, we simply have to skip the author attribution and move straight on to the title. Now, because an article of a newspaper is part of a whole, an article is part of an issue, we have to begin with the title in quotation marks rather than italics. And within those quotation marks, we want to include the entire headline if there is one. And in this case, that headline is Sir Charles Napier again. Now, as to that last full stop, this is really a matter of choice. If you're wanting to make it as clear as possible which article you're referring to, it's sometimes helpful to include those typographical or punctuation marks. If there's not really any chance that it's going to be confused with another article, and you want to just make it look a bit more consistent, you can neglect it. In this particular case, it's pretty obvious what I'm referring to, so I'm just going to admit it. However, because this is a footnote rather than a bibliography entry, and footnotes are like sentences, we do need to include a comma to indicate the title has concluded and we are now moving on to the publication information. So like a normal English sentence, we put the comma inside the quotation mark before continuing on to our title. Now, the title of the publication is The Dundee Courier, and we do want to include that entire title. But in Chicago style, we usually exclude the first article, the of the Dundee Courier, and just put Dundee Courier, New York Times, so on and so on. If you're doing a non-English language newspaper like Le Monde, you do want to include the article there because English grammar and French or Spanish grammar is quite different, and it won't make a whole lot of sense without that article. But in this case, this newspaper is from Scotland, so we're going to leave the article out. Control I to go into italics, Dundee Courier, And after the title, we want to put a little bit of geographical information to make it clear which Dundee Courier we're talking about. While it may seem obvious that the Dundee Courier refers to the original Dundee in Scotland in the United Kingdom, that's not necessarily the case. The Scots are a very mobile people and there are other Dundees in the world. So we just want to make this crystal clear that this is the Dundee in the Kingdom of Fife in Scotland in the United Kingdom. So we can put either Scotland, United Kingdom, or just United Kingdom on its own. Either will do just fine. We don't need to put the city name of Dundee because that's already there in the title of the newspaper. If, however, this had just been called The Courier, we would want to put Dundee, United Kingdom, to make that just a little bit clearer. Once we have the title of the newspaper, we need to move on to the specifics of the issue. Now, when we were doing our citations for journals or magazines, we wanted to include issue numbers and volume numbers, and newspapers, generally speaking, do have these as well. But they're not really necessary for a newspaper citation. It's extraneous information that's just going to clog up your newspaper. The information you crucially need is the date. So after the name of the publication and any geographical information, place a comma and then the date, April 17th, 1850. Now, even though I've said 17th, I do not put the TH in that date. I put month, day, comma, year, and I don't put any RDs or THs on that date, just April 17, 1850. At this point, there's a little bit of choice you have to make. Now, for most citations, you would not put a page number. Newspapers tend to have multiple editions, and articles may shift from edition to edition, copy to copy, in terms of where in the issue they lay. However, for historical newspapers, you do want to give as much information as possible so the person doesn't have to go through all 16 pages trying to find that particular newspaper article. There aren't clear section headings or bylines to help you find it in any other way, so page numbers can really help. So in this case, we're just going to put a comma, the number 2, and finalize our full stop there. And that, plain and simple, is the footnote reference for an article in a historical newspaper. But let's do one more example, just in case you don't even have a headline on which to hang your hat. If we go a little bit further up this page, we find another article, an article that begins with Lord Duncan's motion for a repeal. And I'm going to zoom in a little bit because this text is very small compared to the headline of our previous article. Once we have this information, we can decide, are we going to cite it with or without a title? Now, on the one hand, we could simply cite it as this, the Dundee Courier, April 17, 1850, page 2. And your reader would just have to take a little bit on faith that somewhere on that page that information exists. And it's perfectly acceptable, and indeed you'll find reading lots of articles and essays that that's generally what historians do. However, if your aim is to make your citations as informative as possible to help your reader find your information in the actual newspaper, it can be helpful to create a fake or pseudo title. Now, by that I don't mean making up a summary for that article. That's not going to help anyone. Instead, what you want to do is look to the first line of that article and put in a shortened or truncated version, something the reader can find easily as they're scanning down the page. So making sure, again, you're not in italics, but rather in quotation marks, what you want to include is the first few words of that article. Lord Duncan's motion for a repeal of the window duty. And again, we do want to make this capitalized in typical headline or title capitalization. Now, this is, for all intents and purposes, the title or the identifying characteristic of this article. If I were to go to this newspaper, on this date, on this page, I would be able to scan down the left-hand side of every column until I found this sentence, and then I would know which article we had. Now, I don't have an example in this particular issue, but if by chance you did happen to find an article that did have an author, all you would need to do would be to include it at the front of your citation. So for example, John Bull, comma, and then the title, followed by the name of the newspaper, the date, and the page. There are a couple other ways that you can identify a particular piece, and one of them is by column or section title. If we look at this part of page 2, for example, we have the heading Local Intelligence Dundee Trade Report. Now, the title Dundee Trade Report does act as a sort of headline or title for that particular article. But maybe we want to cite something else that's within local intelligence, local Dundee news, but isn't necessarily within that trade report. We can still use the section heading. So rather than include either an author or a title for the article, we can include the section heading. So what do we put as that section title and how do we style it? Well, if we have a section title called Local Intelligence, we want to put it in non-italicized, non-speech marked text. And by that I mean just plain old Local Intelligence, comma, and then on to the title of the newspaper. If you were doing the most complete citation possible, you would likely want to include the author, the title, and the section or column heading. But in a historical newspaper, we're just trying to get as much information, that is, what article we're talking about, with as few words as possible. What is the simplest and most direct way to indicate which article or section you're actually talking about? So you're going to have to use a bit of your judgment. Are you talking about a particular article? Do you have the author? Or are you talking about a section more widely? And is that going to be the better way of indicating it in your footnote? In any case, I would always suggest using a page number in your footnotes for historical newspapers, as they are the triest, truest, and easiest way to find a newspaper article. When it comes to your bibliography entry, you really don't need to put in newspaper articles individually. Like a manuscript, however, if there's only one article that you have used from that entire newspaper run, you could put that article in as a separate primary source. So, for example, Bull John, full stop, article title, full stop, Dundee Courier, United Kingdom, April 17, 1852. That is a very complete entry for your bibliography. However, it's not very likely that you're going to cite just a single article from a particular issue or even a newspaper at all. Usually you're citing several articles across a long period of time. So you want to have a more general bibliography entry. So rather than put in individual articles or authors, we start with just Dundee Courier, United Kingdom. And if you want to give a particular date range, you can put that in as well. So say for example, you were looking at all the newspapers between 1825 and 1850, you would want to indicate that in this way. Now what do we put between these two dates? Well, we do not put a hyphen or this mark, it's too short. We need to use that in dash to indicate a year range. And we do that by holding down the left Alt and then using our number pad, Alt 0150. At the end of this, you put a full stop, and that's your entire bibliography entry, the Dundee Courier from the United Kingdom between 1825 and 1850. Always use the date range that you actually cite as opposed to the date range you consulted, just to be that little bit more clear. And there you go. It's really as simple as that. The most basic form of a historical newspaper citation is just the newspaper, the date, and the page, and as much about the author, the title, and the section as you can provide. Thanks for watching. I hope you found this video useful. If you did, please consider hitting the like or subscribe button. That'll let me know this is the type of video you would like to see more of. And if you have any questions or suggestions for upcoming videos, go ahead and put those down in the comments below.